Sir William Phips was a shepherd boy born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a shipwright, ship's captain, treasure hunter, a major general, and the first royally appointed governor of the Province of Massachusetts Bay. He is perhaps best remembered for establishing, and later overruling and disbanding, the court associated with the infamous Salem Witch Trials. Of humble origin, uneducated, and fatherless from a young age, he watched over his family's flock of sheep before apprenticing to a shipbuilder near his home in present-day Maine. He moved to Boston to start a business building ships and soon began to embark on treasure-hunting expeditions to the West Indies. He became famous in London and Boston for recovering a large treasure from a sunken Spanish galleon, a feat that earned him instant wealth and a knighthood. In 1690, during King William's War, Phips was commissioned as a major general the same day he was first allowed to vote. He led a successful military expedition against Port Royal, the capital of Acadia, followed by an unsuccessful attempt to capture Quebec. 2 years later, Phips was appointed as governor. He had successfully straddled a middle political position, cultivating a strong connection to the powerful New England Minster, increase Mather, as well as his royalist opposition on the Board of Trade. Phips and Mather returned to the Massachusetts Bay Colony from England at the height of the witchcraft delusion. After numerous executions in Salem, Phips suspended the court proceedings, pardoned several people sentenced to death, and released more than 100 being held in jail before trial. He became enmeshed in related controversies that resulted in his recall to England to answer a variety of charges. Phips died in London at the age of 44 before the charges against him could be heard. Early life. Phips was born the son of James and Mary Phips, in a frontier settlement at Nequassee, near the mouth of the Kennebec River. His father died when the boy was 6 years old, and his mother married a neighbor and business partner, John White. Although Cotton Mather in his biography of Phips claimed that he was one of 26 children, this number is likely an exaggeration or included many who did not survive infancy. His mother is known to have had 6 children by Phips, and 8 by White. His father was poor, but his ancestry may have descended from country gentry in Nottinghamshire, at least technically. Constantine Phips seems to have been a cousin of Phips, 5 years his junior. According to Mather, Phips was a shepherd until the age of 18, after which he began a 4-year apprenticeship as a ship's carpenter. He received no formal schooling. Despite a keen intelligence, his literacy skills were likely rudimentary. Robert Calif wrote, "It will be generally acknowledged that notwithstanding the meanness of his parentage and education, he attained to be master of a ship." Once Phips achieved wealth and fame, he relied on a personal secretary and scribes for assistance, as was common for many figures of the time. After his apprenticeship ended in 1673, Phips traveled to Boston, where he continued to employ his shipmaking and carpentry skills. About a year later he married Mary Spencer Hull, widow to John Hull. Mary's father, Daniel Spencer, was a merchant and landowner with interests in Maine. Phips may have known Mary from an early age. By all accounts, the couple exhibited genuine affection for one another, and there is no evidence Phips was unfaithful during his long absences from home. Phips established a shipyard on the Sheepscot River at Merrymeeting Bay in Maine in 1675 at the outbreak of King Philip's War. The shipyard was successful, turning out a number of small boats and building its first large merchant ship in 1676. As he was preparing for its maiden voyage in August 1676, planning to deliver a load of lumber to Boston, a band of Indians descended on the area during the Northeast Coast Campaign. Rather than take on his cargo, he took on board as many of the local settlers as he could. Although he was financially ruined, Phips was considered a hero among the colonists in Boston. In the early 1680s, Phips began to engage in a favorite colonial pastime of treasure hunting in the Bahamas. As captain of the Resolution, he was seeking treasure from sunken Spanish ships near New Providence. The expedition is not well documented but seems to have been profitable, returning shares worth £54 to certain low-level participants. New England Mint Master John Hull was one of his investors. Phips earned a widespread reputation for continually finding sunken ships. The Strange Voyage of HMS Rose of Algerie. Narboro's treasure hunt. On May 2, 1683, the captain of the frigate HMS Falcon was sailing from England to the West Indies and beckoned the other officers to be present as he broke open his secret instructions. He learned that his mission was to aid in the hunt for a large treasure near Hispaniola. A sloop in convoy, HMS Bonetta, was designated to do most of the searching, but the Falcon would act as aid and protection. These instructions were from Sir John Narborough, a Rear Admiral and Commissioner of the Royal Navy, who also had the ear of King Charles II. Around this same time, the 32-year-old Phips had made his way to England, where he gained an audience with Narborough and Charles II. By any measure, this was a remarkable achievement for a poor New Englander like Phips, but it also seems clear that he must have been at the right place at the right time. His reputation for finding sunken ships may have preceded him, and he seems to have had demonstrable gains to show, as one letter writer mentions his late successful returns. Perhaps he delivered the king's portion of these returns to Whitehall in person. In any case, a reckless plan was concocted, probably by Narborough, whereby this New England native, despite having no background in the English Navy, would be assigned as the commander of a 20-gun frigate HMS Rose of Algiers for a treasure hunt. But given no other financial backing, he and his crew would be required to pay for all other expenses of the voyage, including food and diving equipment, and give a deposit of £100. Of the treasure they found, 35% would go to the king, and the rest would be divided among the otherwise unpaid crew. The plan seemed ill-conceived and suggests that Narborough was obsessed by the possibility of treasure. It is also possible that Phips was being used in a complex way, with the sly intention that HMS Rose would act as a noisy decoy for his more important treasure hunt. Unlike the Falcon and Bonetta, Phips was not sent directly to search near Hispaniola, where Narborough believed a great treasure lay buried. His instructions were not kept secret but were signed by the entire crew, thereby broadcasting the designs through the harbour and shipyards. On July 13, 1683, the Articles of Agreement were signed by Phips and 7 other crew members, in the presence of Narborough and Haddock, delivering Randolph, evil genius of New England. Before Phips could set sail, he had another mission added to the manifest. Edward Randolph, indefatigable foe of Puritans, was serving Boston with a writ of quo warranto against the precious Charter of Massachusetts, and searching for a frigate to be the muscle backing him. It is essential that a frigate should be on the New England coast at such a time to second the quo warranto and hasten submission. A war vessel be present to all them. Randolph hoped such a display would induce New England to submit to revisions of their charter from the Crown, rather than having it fully revoked. On August 3, 1683, Randolph wrote to Sir Leonine Jenkins, "I am now informed that the HMS Rose is already fitted out for the Bahamas with orders to call at Boston for 2 or 3 weeks on the way. Randolph indicates that time is of the essence and he is willing to travel with Phips to forego the frigate idea and embark on a merchantman. Randolph, along with his brother Bernard, were given passage and cabins on HMS Rose. As told by John Knepp just before the Rose set sail, things were complicated again when the Crown decided to place a minder on board named John Knepp to look after the King's interest. Knepp seems to have been a purser. In the English Navy, the purser acted as a sort of company store, tempting sailors far from shore with whiskey, tobacco and other desirables by offering them credit against the wages. It was a lucrative post and required an investment to procure. Hence it usually went to young naval clerks and scions who could afford the capital outlay. It seems like a terrible idea to place a purser on a voyage like that of the Rose, on a shoestring budget, with the men receiving no wages and collectively buying and sharing food together. But either way, the purser was dependent on good relations with the captain. Yet Knepp seems to have looked down on Phips and decided to be forward in introducing himself to the crew of HMS Rose while Phips was absent in London. The reception was rather less than friendly. Then most of them began to curse the ship and wished she had been afire before they saw her and that they had better have hired a ship of merchants. A crew were a salty bunch to say the least, a rum lot as Peter Earle calls them, and this final last-minute bait and switch, after the previous edition of Randolph, seems to have nearly put them over the edge. Everything we know about the crew comes from a detailed journal of the trip to Boston was kept by Knepp, and he has rightly been called a hostile observer, but it is more important to note that he was often ignorant of the complex, dual nature of the voyage, as well as basic colonial politics, if not some important elements of human nature. Distant historians must grope for any available source to shed light on events of the past, and so history tends to be swayed heavily by the writers. Phips was never a writer, and so much of his story comes from others, with Knepp's journal at the top of this pile. Like the rest of us, Knepp does not seem to have understood the role Phips was intended to play, either in support of Randolph, or as a possible decoy and clean-up for the Falcon and Amp by Netter. In Knepp's first interaction, he says that he is seeking signatures between the crew and the King, though the July 13th agreement would more accurately be portrayed as between Phips and the crew. As the first mate protests, Knepp's job seemed to be to seek additional signatures from the crew, which is easily done when Phips returns to the ship, with Randolph acting as a witness. Next, Knepp complained to Phips about the firing of the ship's cannons to set the watch. By the time the ship set sail the next day, Phips and Knepp were distinctly at odds, as Knepp records when asked for a cabin, a berth, and was told he would have to make do sleeping on a trunk. This was an unfortunate turn of events for both of them, as well as the historian, who would prefer to have Knepp at the captain's table recording the dinner conversation between Randolph, his brother, and Phips. Class friction surely played a strong role in the conflict between Knepp and Phips. Knepp consistently presents himself as a victim, and there are many times he is bullied and badly mistreated. But it also seems that he must have set himself above, and thought of himself as being of a higher class than Phips. The Articles of Agreement testify to the trust that the King and Narborough placed in Phips, and the crew seemed willing to do as Phips commanded. But Knepp acts as if he is not beholden to Phips. Knepp's journal is addressed to Narborough, and it reads like a sycophant's strong gambit for a future promotion. He presents Phips as the trope of a tarpaulin captain, every sailor his comrade. Questionable literacy level, and so it is probably safe to infer that Knepp was of the gentleman class and likely some years younger than Phips, perhaps in his mid-20s. Knepp is excellent at taking coordinates and seems trained in piloting, but does not exhibit the breadth of experience and knowledge of the rigging. Though he records every perceived misstep by Phips, his careful plotting of the journey also shows the great ability Phips possessed as a sailor, crossing the Atlantic in half the time of another ship that they meet, and making first landfall at Cape Ann. Randolph arrived at Boston on October 27. Increase Mather recorded his one and only diary entry for all of 1683. Randolph arrived at Boston. Phips quickly began to provide a show of force for Randolph by insisting other ships strike the colors and firing across the bows if they did not. Knapp claims that Narborough did not condone this, and many historians have followed his lead in treating Phips' activities in Boston Harbor as arrogant showboating. But it seems clear from the letters of Randolph and Blathwayt that Phips was not doing this merely for some explosive fun. Phips cites personal instructions from the king, and indeed Charles II was known to have insisted on a salute to his flag. As Phips was creating chaos for the Massachusetts government, he continued to pursue his original intention of gathering diving equipment and divers to take to the Bahamas. Phips later followed the same procedures of requiring ships to strike in the West Indies and with a new crew in Bermuda. Phips' lack of experience in the Royal Navy would suggest he likely made mistakes and did not always go about this procedure in the best way. It must have been a strange and uncomfortable chore for someone whose loyalties were with Boston. Randolph was never one to withhold criticism, but he did not complain of Phips' activities in Boston Harbor that winter, and Randolph even seems to have assisted Phips by searching a ship for him. But choosing a threatening posture showed Randolph's inability to understand the New England character, and it did not produce the effect Randolph intended. The magistrates voted to submit to the crown, but the deputies resisted. Phips and the Rose became a focal point for the resistance, as Knapp dutifully recorded without understanding the subtext. Phips' crew say that they would as soon fire against this town as against Algiers and called us rebels. Is one deposition Knapp records, though Knapp seems to believe he is merely recording of barroom brawl. One of the constables in particular told him that he thought Captain Phips had been a town-born child. Captain Phips answering him, "Let him be what he would. He had been sworn at 16 years of age to be true to the king and his government." Randolph's writ of quo warranto required a response from Massachusetts by the end of Michaelmas term. Empty-handed, Randolph and his brother boarded a Pink bound for England on December 14. A few days later, Phips began making preparations but was detained by problems with the Boston government and the ongoing search for victuals. In a discussion with Phips, Knapp allows, as a purser, that many of the crew owe him money, and says that he would have them thrown into jail except that it would hinder His Majesty's treasure hunt. Phips finally sailed clear of the Boston harbor on January 19, 1684, but unfortunately not before some of his roguish crew could cause a small riot in Boston and perpetrate a despicable assault in Hull. According to Knapp, Knapp was not on board, meaning he had effectively deserted according to the articles, though I should be almost undone by it, and so it became all the more important for Knapp to show Phips in a bad light. 2 days after Phips left the Boston area, Increase Mather gave a rousing speech to the deputies and freemen advising them not to submit to the crown and to resist the quo warranto. One historian calls this Increase Mather's first important entry into politics. Mather's remarkable providences was distributed this same month, with echoes to the New England government. Increase Mather assembles in 1692. It had been Phips' debut into colonial politics too, if clumsily and involuntarily. To what extent he was swayed by the arguments of Randolph as they crossed the Atlantic, it is hard hard to know, but Phips certainly played the role with bluster, and he seems to have spoken up as a royalist to the Boston government in the meetings he had with Bradstreet and Stoughton, at least as recorded by Knapp. By 1688, Phips would cross over to increase Mather's side and begin to consistently oppose Randolph and the Dominion government he helped to bring about, and with a vehemence that would seem to suggest some degree of shame and dismay for the role he played as captain of HMS Rose in 1683–4. After leaving Boston, Phips searched the Pictover wrecks in the Bahamas with limited success. Too many other treasure hunters had already gone before. When some of his crew became mutinous, he had them put off in Jamaica. On November 18, 1684, Phips was in Port Royal, Jamaica, the same time as Captain Stanley of the Bonetta. There is no record of the joining forces or sharing information. It seems likely they met up, but we don't know if it was preordained. If Phips was unwittingly being used as a decoy to distract the other treasure hunters away from Stanley, it might have dawned on him at this time. Soon after, Phips visited the north coast of Hispaniola and slowly cruised north, exploring the banks where Stanley had been diligently searching for over a year. The decisiveness with which Phips later returned and quickly located the treasure suggests that he was able to gather valuable knowledge and begin to formulate a clear plan, though he would have to wait 2 years to bring it to fruition. After Phips returned to London in August of 1685, Samuel Pepys ordered the Navy Board to assess the Rose. Pepys had been out of power when Narborough set the strange plan in motion. In March and May of 1686, Phips was ordered to attend the Lord Treasurer, where it was found that the King was only to receive £471 in treasure, though the wear and tear on the Rose was estimated at £700. In this age of piracy and high mortality, Phips making it back to London alive and with the King's ship still afloat was probably enough for him to pass the test. Already Narborough had a new plan in the works for Captain Phips, though this time it would be a private venture. Narborough's long infatuation with the Hispaniola treasure had not been diminished by Captain Stanley's discouragement on the Bonetta, and Knapp's report on Phips did not disqualify him. Phips had shown that he was serviceable, willing to harass the harbour of his hometown and to compromise between his own interests and the interests of the Crown. This was surely noted at Whitehall, even by the more conservative elements. Striking silver and amp gold, with Captain Stanley of the Bonetta expressing disinterest in continuing to search for the Hispaniola treasure, while Captain Phips probably expressed enthusiasm and new confidence. The next logical choice for commander was obvious. Narborough turned to the hard-partying Duke of Albemarle, who assembled a group of private investors to fund another expedition. Phips was tasked with finding suitable ships, and these came to be the James and Mary, a 22-gun 200-ton frigate, and the 45-ton Henry of London, a sloop commanded by Francis Rogers, his second mate on the previous voyage. Phips utilized their experience as a sailor and shipwright to select high-quality anchors, chains, and cables to hold their ships securely in close proximity to the shoals for months as they tried to fish treasure from it. £500 worth of merchandise was taken along to barter for provisions, as well as to provide cover or arrears that they were in Hispaniola merely as merchants, not treasure hunters. The London investors must have felt confident because they paid a total of £3,210 outfitting the ships for the voyage. Unlike the voyage of the Rose, the crew were to be paid regular wages. Phips sailed from the Downs on the 12th of September 1686, and on the 28th of November arrived in Hispaniola, Samana Bay, where they spent 2 weeks restocking the water and provender. The weather was bad, and the search consequently did not get underway for a few more weeks. January 12. Phips sent out Captain Rogers in the smaller Henry of London along with 3 Native American divers to search what was then called the Ambrosia Bank. There was a bit more delay from weather, but Peter Earle writes, "There is no doubt that he knew exactly where he was going." January 20th, they spotted cannons from a shipwreck lying on the white sands of the reef. The ship they had found was the Almirante of the Spanish Silver Fleet, wrecked in 1641. Over the next 2 days, the divers were able to bring up 3,000 coins and 3 silver bars. They decided to travel back to Phips to let him know, but this turned out to be a somewhat slow and treacherous trip among the reefs. After Phips was discreetly informed of their amazing find, he spent the next 9 days preparing the ships and gathering enough food to sustain the men over months of bringing up treasure. Through March and April, the divers and ship's crews worked to recover all manner of treasure: silver coins, silver bullion, doubloons, jewelry, a small amount of gold, and other artifacts. Concerned about the possibility of mutiny, Phips guaranteed to the crew, who had been hired for seamen's wages, that they would receive shares in the find, even if he had to pay them from his own percentage. He carefully avoided putting in at any ports before anchoring at Gravesend, where he dispatched a courier to London with the news. The treasure weighed in at over 34 tons, or 205,536 pounds. Almost a quarter went to Albemarle. Phips, after paying out £8,000 in crew shares, received £11,000. Phips was treated as a hero in London, and the find was the talk of the town. Some economic historians argue that Phips' find significantly affected history because it led to a major increase in the formation of joint stock companies, and even played a role in the eventual formation in the Bank of England. Phips and the crew were rewarded by the investors with medals, and Phips was knighted by James in June. James also rewarded Phips with the post of Provost Marshal General of the Dominion of New England, serving under Sir Edmund Andros. In September 1687, Phips returned to the wreck, though he did not command the venture. Admiral Narborough elected to personally lead the expedition, but it was not nearly as successful. The wreck had been discovered by others, and the arrival of the English scattered more than 20 smaller ships. Treasure worth £10,000 was recovered before Narborough's death in May 1688 brought the expedition to an end. Phips had by then already left the wreck site in early May, sailing for Boston for what seems to have been his first time home in 4.5 years, to take up his new post as Provost Marshal General.